Scott had always considered his life with Jewel to be perfect, or at least close to it. She was loving, devoted, and everything he'd ever wanted in a partner. But recently, small cracks began to appear in their once harmonious routine. Jewel started coming home later than usual, and her once cheerful demeanor grew distant. She'd hide her phone when he entered the room, something that was completely out of character for her. Scott couldn't shake the growing suspicion in the pit of his stomach, but he told himself it was nothing. He wasn't the paranoid type. Maybe she was just busy with work. Maybe he was imagining things. Still, gnawing doubt remained. As weeks went by, the distance between Scott and Jewel continued to grow. She was more secretive, often engrossed in her phone, sometimes texting at odd hours, and the late nights became more frequent. Scott would ask where she'd been, but her answers were vague, evasive. He could feel something shifting between them, but each time he tried to confront her, he was met with defensiveness or indifference. The doubt slowly started to fester into something deeper. Should he push her for the truth, or was he just being paranoid? The more he thought about it, the less sure he was of what was real. There was no proof, but everything about her behavior suggested something was off. He couldn't let it go, though the idea of confronting her terrified him. One evening, as Jewel's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, Scott couldn't resist the urge to check. He had convinced himself that if he didn't find anything, he could stop worrying. But when he picked it up, a message from an unfamiliar name caught his eye. "Can't wait to see you tonight. I miss you," the message read. His heart dropped. He reread the message, his mind racing. It was unmistakable. This wasn't just a late-night text from a friend or coworker. It was the message of someone who had a secret. His hands shook as he unlocked her phone, scanning through the thread. The words cut through him like a knife, each one confirming his worst fear. She was having an affair. The rage and heartbreak hit him all at once, but so did a strange numbness. He stood there in shock, unable to fully comprehend what was happening, but knowing one thing for certain: everything he had believed in was a lie. Scott confronted Jewel that night, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and disbelief. She stood frozen for a moment, the truth settling between them like a heavy weight. When he asked her about the messages, she hesitated before finally admitting it. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she tried to explain, her voice small. "It's just, things have been different between us. I don't know what went wrong." Her words only stung more. Scott's mind was spinning as she continued, trying to justify her actions, to make excuses. But nothing she said could erase the betrayal. The devastation on his face was palpable as he tried to understand how the woman he loved could do this to him. His heart ached, not only from the affair but from the realization that she had lied to him for so long. In that moment, everything he had trusted crumbled away. The days after the confrontation felt like a blur. Scott barely slept, spending his nights tossing and turning, his mind replaying every moment with Jewel. The hurt was overwhelming. He felt like he was drowning in a sea of confusion and pain. His home felt empty, a place where memories that once brought him comfort now only served to remind him of what had been taken from him. There were moments when he found himself spiraling into anger, fantasizing about revenge, imagining how he could make Jewel suffer as he had. But there was no satisfaction in those thoughts, only a gnawing emptiness that refused to go away. He had been betrayed, and no amount of anger could change that. Yet the idea of making her pay lingered in the back of his mind, feeding his sense of injustice. Something inside him wanted her to feel the consequences of her actions. Scott's anger slowly transformed into a cold, calculated determination. Jewel's carelessness gave him an opportunity. He started to pay closer attention to her routines, the little things she left behind. Her phone became a window into her world, and soon he had access to it again, scouring her messages and emails. He meticulously pieced together every detail of the affair, each message another piece of ammunition in his growing arsenal. As he discovered more, his sense of control grew. He knew what he had to do next. He started fabricating evidence, creating fake emails, planting messages that made the affair appear even worse than it was. He could feel the web of deception tightening, and a dark satisfaction surged through him. This wasn't just about punishing Jewel. It was about taking back control, about ensuring she paid for everything she had done. Scott spent weeks carefully constructing his plan, weaving lies and half-truths into an elaborate scheme designed to ruin Jewel's life. He planted fake emails in her inbox, sent herself anonymous messages, and made sure everything lined up perfectly. Every detail was crafted to be irrefutable. He watched from the sidelines as Jewel's life continued, unaware of the trap closing in on her. The evidence was now undeniable, and Scott could feel the tension building. Soon, everything would come to a head. He knew the moment of truth was fast approaching. He was no longer just the hurt husband. He was the puppet master, and Jewel was about to walk right into his hands. The revenge he had dreamed of was finally within his reach. It was a cold morning when the knock came. Scott stood in the hallway, his heart pounding as the police officer handed him a warrant and stepped inside. He watched Jewel's face drain of color as they read the charges: fraud, embezzlement, and adultery. She stammered in disbelief, trying to deny it all, but the evidence was overwhelming. Scott stood back, his expression unreadable, as Jewel's world unraveled before her eyes. The satisfaction he had imagined never came, only a hollow sense of inevitability. He could see the fear in her eyes, the realization that she had been trapped. He felt nothing as she was cuffed, taken away by the officers. The moment of vengeance had arrived, but for some reason it didn't feel like victory. The sight of Jewel being led away in handcuffs was almost surreal. As the police escorted her out, she turned to him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear, confusion, and realization. Their eyes locked for a brief, intense moment, and Scott saw the flicker of recognition in her gaze. She knew she had been played. But even as she was driven away, Scott felt no triumph. The weight of everything that had happened pressed down on him, and he realized that the woman he had once loved was now nothing more than a stranger. The satisfaction he thought he would feel never came. It was as if the finality of it all had stolen something from him too. The trial became a media spectacle, drawing attention from every corner. Jewel's name was dragged through the mud, her reputation crumbling as more and more details of her affair and crimes came to light. Scott watched from the sidelines, detached, as reporters and onlookers scrutinized her every move. The evidence against her was undeniable, and there was little doubt about the outcome. But as the trial dragged on, Scott realized that his emotions had become muted. He wasn't the angry husband seeking justice anymore. He was a spectator, waiting for the inevitable conclusion. As the trial reached its climax, the sense of closure he had anticipated never materialized. The reality was far less satisfying than he had imagined. When the verdict was read and Jewel was sentenced, Scott stood silently in the courtroom, his face a mask of indifference. She was guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, and adultery. But instead of feeling the satisfaction of victory, Scott felt emptiness. The revenge he had so carefully orchestrated had done little to heal the wounds Jewel's betrayal had caused. Life after the trial felt hollow. Friends distanced themselves from him, unsure of how to approach someone who had been so publicly embroiled in scandal. His home felt even emptier now, a shell of the life he once had. Even though he had won, the victory felt meaningless. He had thought revenge would give him closure, but instead, it had left him with a deep, gnawing emptiness. Months later, Scott received a letter from Jewel, sent from prison. She didn't apologize, but her words struck him all the same. She wrote about how he had abandoned her, how he had taken everything from her once the scandal broke. In the letter, Jewel admitted that the affair had never been about love, but infatuation. She had acted on impulse, driven by desires she couldn't control. Scott read the letter, his heart heavy, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something close to closure. But it was fleeting, and the emptiness that had consumed him for so long remained. The finality of the letter was a reminder that revenge, though satisfying in its moment, did little to fill the hole inside him. Looking back on everything that had happened, Scott couldn't shake the feeling that something had been lost, something irreversible. The revenge he had sought had not brought him the peace or satisfaction he had imagined. Instead, it had left him scarred, just as much as it had scarred Jewel. He had exacted his revenge, but in doing so, he had destroyed not only her life but his own. The emptiness that remained after it all settled in was a reminder of the high cost of vengeance. While Jewel had paid for her betrayal, so had he. And in the end, he realized that sometimes the person you want to hurt the most has already lost everything.